Thank you. Now, when I was last out on this stage, I had a world-renowned journalist who was also incredibly witty, and that was wonderful. So I'm just going to have to do the best I can. But I came armed with a few slides, and we all know, and we've talked this morning about how journalism and media is about storytelling. So what better way for me to start than to give you a story about how media companies have come to dominate the competition for attention in social networks, as told in 4 parts. And I've only got, I think it's 297 slides, so I'm going to get through it here. You think I'm kidding, actually, but I do. But that's okay, it'll go quick. So let's begin here. The journey. Starting in 2008 to 2016, I picked that for personal reasons because that's when I actually started working with Facebook professionally. But before I dive into that, I want to make a point here that you're going to hear a couple times throughout this presentation, and you probably don't hear this enough in your day-to-day lives, and that is that your content matters, and you're winning. And hopefully that's, this is not news to you, and hopefully it's consistent with what you've heard today. Somebody once told me you're not supposed to bury the lead, so I wanted to get that out of the way and just make sure we said it, because I don't think people say it often enough. There are some platform challenges like Kara talked about, and we'll get into that a little bit, but you are winning. You're doing great work. You're getting great content out there. As Frank Spicer showed you this morning in his presentation, the numbers are just amazing. So back to today. It's February 2016. We're sitting here. We've got a socially savvy audience. Most of you are from media companies. We have a few agencies and other folks in here, but most of this audience is media company audience. You've made big investments in social distribution, right? And so how do we get to this point, right? How did we get to where we are in 2016? Well, you can't talk about where we are in social media without talking about Facebook and the rise of Facebook. I love this chart here. It's actually quite dated. You'll see the x-axis ends at 2011. And that's MySpace's growth curve. It's not really a growth curve when it's going down, I guess. In 2011, I'm not sure where it went from there, but I have an idea that it wasn't up. And then that's Facebook's growth curve, which even at the time, back in 2011, was somewhere around 700 million. And you see it's sort of tapering off. You're like, okay, well, I mean, 700 million is huge. It clearly can't get much bigger than that. And in order to show you how much bigger than that it got, of course, I have to shrink it down because the y-axis isn't big enough, right? It's like, holy cow, I mean, 1.6 billion. I think that's an accurate number. I went and looked it up. I heard somebody say 1.4, 1.3, but let's not argue or quibble over 400 million. I mean, it's no big deal, right? I mean, it's just, you know, they're big, right? We all know that Facebook is huge. They're worth more or about the same as General Electric. They're dominant in lots of ways. As Kara said, that's not necessarily a good thing, but it's a platform that we all have dependencies on, and it is an incredible vehicle for distribution of content, and they've aggregated an incredible audience. So again, as Kara said, Mark Zuckerberg is quite smart and surrounds himself with smart people. And so they've done a lot of interesting things. But remember, we were going to go back to 2008, and that's when I started professionally working with Facebook. And at the time, it was actually smaller than MySpace. And we could see that that curve was going up, and it looked like it was going to surpass MySpace, and you sort of figured it was going to pass. I can't imagine anybody, including Mark Zuckerberg, had any idea that it was going to do what it did. And so back then in 2008 and 2009, I was with a company called Vitru that was acquired by Oracle. We were working primarily with marketers, you know, Procter & Gamble, McDonald's, Apple, you know, big consumer marketers, and they all wanted to be on social networks because basically that's where people were starting to go. It was really popular. They were growing even back then, you know, getting into the hundreds of millions of users. And what that looked like, if you remember, I mean, most of you have been involved with social for a while. You remember Facebook tabs and that tab navigation across the top there? This was an old Nike page I found there. And so it was essentially taking your website or your microsite, recreating it on Facebook in a tab, maybe adding some viral functionality and trying to do cool things, right? So nothing wrong with that. We did some interesting things and some good work. The marketers clearly wanted to build their fan bases on Facebook, or actually Twitter was relevant at the time, follower bases there. And there was either expressly stated or implicit as, hey, you get to bypass the traditional media companies, right? And the cost of advertising with traditional media companies. And so as I mentioned, Facebook, Twitter, they're both doing that. Google Plus, you know, came along and, ooh, whoops, it's gone now. So, but who wouldn't like free advertising, right? Free advertising in perpetuity. No wonder everybody flocked to social. Advertisers loved it. It's a great value proposition. I can just sort of build up a fan base, 5, 10, 15 million fans, message them 4, 6, 8, 10 times a day. They all see my content. I'm not paying a dime other than content creation. You know, I'm a brand, and I can sort of build my own newsroom, and, you know, life is good. But let's fast forward a little bit to 2014. You know, some of the language that got created in this journey, if you want to call it that, was we're going to have authentic brand conversations. Okay, well, maybe. But really, in 2014, that's really when the disappointment started to set in, especially for marketers. And when I say disappointment, I'm talking about a lot of disappointment. Marketers were angry, actually probably more than even disappointed, because this value they thought they were going to get, free advertising in perpetuity, didn't really turn out to be that way. And there's a lot of resentment of Facebook for that. And I understand that. And I don't know what promises were expressed or implied to advertisers. So hard for me to say exactly what, whether their disappointment and anger is valid. But I can explain what's going on. And you can tell I'm an engineer here with this chart here. So one line on a chart and an X and Y axis. So very simple here. Content in my feed, right? So all of us are, as consumers of, this is about Facebook, but it could be about Twitter too, and hours in my day, right? I mean, what's going to happen, right? You got more and more content competing for a fixed amount of attention. What possible outcome is there other than, just an increasing competition for attention? And as it turns out, users don't really want the advertisers' free posts. So whether they want advertising is a different topic. We'll talk about that a little bit too. But certainly the free posts from the advertiser, if I have a post from New York Magazine or Time or the New York Times or whatever, and one from Tide, okay, I think we know which one I'm going to choose. And as it turns out, neither did really the social networks want the free posts. Right, and so Facebook is the most obvious example with EdgeRank and what they did. EdgeRank, very simplistically defined, is the good content floats to the top, and the less good content, as judged by the user, sinks to the bottom. And I think we know where media company content falls, and we know where typical brand content most often falls. And so that's, again, a grossly oversimplified explanation of what's been going on here over the past couple of years. And so there's more content than anyone could possibly consume. And of course, in the midst of all that, we've got the rise of mobile, right? The iPhone was introduced and, back early on in this journey that we're talking about, but it really sort of took off, and Android and everything else, and now the smartphones became the thing. So really, the playing field shrunk in the midst of all this, and there were some fairly significant strategic decisions, especially that Facebook made, but really every social platform made, to say, wow, we really have to focus on mobile. Very different playing field than what you were talking about with desktop and that tabs example I was showing. So you've got less screen real estate, and of course, when you have less screen real estate, the quality of content is even more important. So that, I think, accelerated the transformation as well of what we saw on the social networks. So the solution, of course, is to surface more content from professionals, which is exactly what Facebook did with EdgeRank. And professionals, we know, produce more content. It's better content, and the audience knows it. And so I'm going to take a little bit of a detour here, and I want to give you a personal, brief anecdote here. And like all the best anecdotes, this one's about laundry detergent. So Tide, I heard somebody in a previous presentation mention Tide. Tide is a laundry detergent. I think everybody knows that. Procter & Gamble is the manufacturer of Tide. That's one of the biggest advertisers in the world. I use Tide, which, there you go, there's a washing machine, and that's pretty much irrelevant to you. I understand that, but go with me for a second if you would. I actually built Facebook apps for Tide back at Vitru. Procter & Gamble was a customer of ours, and we did some good work, stuff like this. Remember the allow access dialogue where you could do that kind of stuff? I know this is like really old school. I see the grimaces. And I'm proud of the work we did. I'm not necessarily saying we should go back to it, but it was, it was interesting work. It was innovative at the time. It was important at the time. And the fact that we've moved beyond that is perfectly fine, but we did some interesting things. But furthermore, I actually spent weeks inside the factories that make Tide, and this is where you definitely know I'm an engineer, right? This was actually a laundry detergent manufacturing facility that I spent a lot of time in, and that's because I'm an engineer. Again, not terribly relevant, but I did want to tell you, I got to go into the perfume room at the laundry detergent plant. And you're thinking, oh, the perfume room, it looks something like this. No, it's actually a room full of 55-gallon drums of concentrated Tide smell. And imagine 1,000 bottles of Tide up your nose at one time. I mean, it is seared in your brain. It was an intense smell. It's one of the most intense experiences I've ever had from an olfactory perspective. I do not recommend it. But I tell you all this, again, thank you for indulging my detour. I tell you this so you can say that I know Tide, right? It's clear. Jim knows Tide. I use Tide. I recommend Tide. Tide's a great laundry detergent if you're looking for one. I know how Tide is made. I put Tide in my presentations, for goodness sake. But there's a Tide post in my Facebook feed. There's a Tide post in my Twitter feed. I don't want it in my social feed, and neither do you. I mean, let's be honest. Neither does anybody. Nobody really wants the Tide post. Not when there's so much other more interesting content that you could get in your feed. Maybe the Tide brand manager wants it in their feed for obvious commercial reasons. I want content. I suspect you want content. Content that informs, that entertains, that makes me think, that makes me mad. Yeah, I'll tolerate paid advertising. We all know the world works off of advertising, and we've been talking quite a bit about ways that we can monetize and do things, and that's really important. I don't want it to be too intrusive. I don't want to degrade my experience, and sadly, a lot of mobile advertising, especially outside the social ecosystems, is very invasive and degrades the user experience. We all know that. But otherwise, I use social networks, and I suspect most people use social networks because they like high-quality content, right? I get content from my friends, I get content from media companies, and then really interestingly, I get content from my friends who share content from media companies, which is really one of the most interesting things. It's sort of my friends help me curate that which I look at, and a sort of a personal recommendation on a story or a post is actually quite useful to me. So I consume a lot of content that way. And so clearly that's where you come in, mostly media companies here. And I just want to reiterate again, your content matters and you're actually winning. So that leads us to part 2 and the flirtation with native, or I could say the rise of native. So we've spent some time earlier today talking about native. We know that native is a controversial topic. You can't hope to read this, but this is a snapshot of the FTC ruling, and I love the title, Enforcement Policy Statement on Deceptively Formatted Advertisements, right? This just came out a couple of weeks ago, and so it's a difficult to define topic, and they do their best in 16 pages to sort of state their position. And you say 16 pages is not so bad. I can read 16 pages. It's a little dry, but I mean, it's not that hard to get through 16 pages, except for the fact that it's got 76 footnotes. 76 footnotes in a 16-page document. I mean, it's insane. And all of those footnotes, by the way, refer to other documents and other websites and other things. So, I mean, again, after reading that 16 pages, I'm not sure you're going to necessarily have a much better view of the issue or a much more defined view without doing some substantial research from there. But I'm just going to go, for purposes of this conversation, because it's a brief amount of time we have here, the typical definition, and this advertising that matches the form and function of the content around it. That's sort of the consistent definition you hear people talk about. I personally find that a little ambiguous, and so I came up with a more pragmatic definition, which is content that's created more for the advertiser than for the audience. Maybe one could quibble with some of that, but maybe it's kind of harsh. But I think most of us would agree it's largely true, right? That's sort of what native is about. It's about the advertiser, and of course you don't want to degrade the user experience, and you do the best you can, but the whole point of creating a native post is an advertiser's paying you to do it. So again, but speaking of harsh, if we're talking about native advertising, everybody I bet in this room has seen the John Oliver piece on native advertising. If you haven't, go Google it. It's quite an epic rant he makes about native advertising. It is hilarious. He's a very talented entertainer. He's a very entertaining speaker, comedian, whatever category he fits in. He does make some really good points about native, and he sort of takes whatever absurdities he can find and really pokes at them pretty hard. I personally think he gets a lot of things wrong about native, though. He comes up with sort of a whole church and state thing that native is just sort of intrinsically evil. And my belief, and I hope and think that many of you all would agree with this, is that publishers and media companies have dealt with potential conflicts of interest for as long as they've accepted advertising. ProPublica did this. This was in April of last year. This is a great story. Again, Google it. At the time, a newspaper stared down the country's largest advertiser. And that story was about how the Wall Street Journal got into a dust-up with General Motors. And this is in 1955, right? I mean, it was a really old story, 60-some-odd years ago. And it was about editorial independence and the face of advertiser pressure and what GM was doing and what the Wall Street Journal was reporting. And without getting into the details of that, which are not necessarily relevant to the topic here, I'll just say that good companies manage that potential conflict of interest well. And most of you all here today fit into that category. You know what you're doing. That's journalism, right? You take advertising because you've got to pay the bills. That doesn't mean you sort of sell your editorial space to the highest bidder. That's not what you do. That's not your brand. That's not your reputation. That's not your ethics or your integrity. So good companies, I think, can very much do native advertising. My issue is that even if you manage that well, which again, I'm going to sort of stipulate that good companies will generally do a pretty good job of managing that conflict of interest, there is a problem. And I don't hear this problem talked about nearly enough, and that's scale. And I mean scale, right? If you want to generate revenue, and you want to generate a lot of revenue because you need to grow your revenues because you've got all the pressures of your businesses to do that, creating custom content for advertisers is expensive. If you want to do twice the content, it basically takes twice the number of people. And remember that line, created more for an advertiser than for the audience. That's not really what most journalists do or want to do. So you end up getting advertising creatives, right? That's what advertising creatives do, which is great if you're an advertising creative. But it's expensive, going back to the scale challenges of native. And a lot of companies will end up using freelancers, part-time workers to manage the volatility, because what you don't want is a fixed labor cost when you have volatile campaigns. So you can say what you want to about the quality and all the other issues there. I'm just saying from an economic perspective, I mean, Native is a reasonable business in times when everybody's challenged and you need to find new revenue streams. I'm not suggesting it's not a reasonable business, but I do think it has difficult unit economics, and I think we're going to see, and I'll predict a little bit later in this presentation, in the future, some of the things that we're going to see because of those difficult unit economics, not to mention the FTC types of issues. And so clearly, once you get to scale, those unit economics become a real problem. And so what really matters, though, clearly is your editorial content. That's your very best content. That's what you're most proud of. That's what you've built your brand around. And again, your content matters, and you're winning. That leads us to part 3. So how is SocialFlow helping? And this was probably the briefest section here. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail because all throughout today, hopefully you've heard about how SocialFlow is helping. Scott Galloway is an NYU marketing professor. He has a much more exotic and longer title than that. He's some kind of special professor of something. But he's a really funny and talented speaker. He's got some great videos out there on YouTube. He presented a chart I saw in one of his presentations that sort of outlined different companies in different industries and some observations. And even Kara alluded to some of this. And so he talked about Airbnb. Wow, it's one of the most valuable lodging or hotel companies in the world, yet they own no hotel rooms. Wow, that's sort of interesting. Uber, one of the most valued transportation companies or taxi companies or however you want to define them, but they own no taxis. And then, much more relevant to this audience, Facebook, one of the most valuable media companies in the world, and they produce no content, essentially. And so with all due respect to these transformative platforms and their very significant and important things that they've done, which is great, they do have huge dependencies. Each one of those 3 has a huge dependency on those who actually provide the content or the service, right? Uber depends on the drivers, Airbnb on the people to make their rooms and their inventory available, and of course Facebook relies on you. I mean, in a big way, right? You all are programming Facebook, a large portion of it. But it's not just Facebook, of course. I mean, Facebook's the big one and it's the easiest to talk about, but it's Twitter, it's Instagram, which of course is owned by Facebook, Pinterest, and that's where SocialFlow really sits. I mean, that's our goal, is to try to help you manage that interaction, get your content out in the most effective way, use the algorithms and the data, generate revenue. I mean, that's the core of our business. How can we help you be more successful on social? So the easier to publish content, I was actually sitting back in the audience this morning. I saw somebody up with this interface on their screen. So hopefully all of you have this interface up. And you don't need me to tell you what it looks like, our publishing interface. Really, it's all about just giving you better results with less effort. And we continue to try to find ways to do that and continue to innovate. Frank talked about the artificial intelligence and the Sanders classifier. You can't really see the details there, but imagine automatically taking your content and classifying it into the different categories without you and your teams having to manually do that. Mobile is a huge area of need. We've heard that from lots of folks. saying we need a better mobile app, and we're actually actively working on that right now, giving you different mobile interfaces and ways, especially for those of you who have talent out in a more distributed fashion, not to mention yourselves when you're just trying to manage your queue and do things. A calendar view is another very common request. We just started working on that. How can I take my content and instead of viewing it in this sort of linear queue, how can I lay it out more visually on a calendar? Because the calendar matters, right? We all have dates and deadlines and expectations, so we're working on that as well. And then even surfacing things like the calendar view in the mobile app is a little bit further down the road, but the kinds of things that we're going to be working on, and we definitely want to continue to add value to you. Video's huge. Again, a fairly ugly screenshot, but showing the video interface. We continue to invest in a lot of resources in helping you manage, upload, and then ultimately monetize video to the social platforms. And then workflow, analytics. We know how important analytics are to everybody in this room, allowing you to surface unique insights back to the editorial teams as well. But that's not enough, and that's where I make a little bit of a shift here into monetization. To Kara's point earlier, I mean, you're putting all this content on Facebook. What do you get out of it, right? So you get click traffic back to your sites, and hopefully you can monetize there. But much more direct monetization, attention stream, which I know Stephanie and Ben have talked about. We've had a couple of sessions, so I won't go through this in any more detail, but just trying to put it in a context that we want you to be able to take your very best content in the feed, sell sponsorship of that content to advertisers, and do so in a way that everybody really wins. And it has much better unit economics than traditional native. And when we get it right, and attention stream is right, it just works, everybody wins, as I mentioned. The social network wins, and like it or not, it's critical for the social network to win because they're the ones that have aggregated the big audience, and if it doesn't work for them, then it's not going to be sustainable, and they're going to change or not allow you to do it. So they have to win in this process to one degree. We have to win because we have to be able to generate revenue to pay the bills to continue to innovate, so it's important for us to have a stake in that process. You're getting progressively more important. You've got to win because it needs to matter to you. You're the ones producing the content. The advertiser has to win because they're the ones paying the bills. And if you want to sell something to an advertiser, they clearly have to win and feel like they're winning. And most importantly, and that's the one that probably most often gets overlooked, is the consumer has to win. Why does the consumer always have to lose in these advertising schemes that come up? And I'd say especially on mobile, there's so much bad user experience. It's so degrading in the long run and so frustrating from a user perspective that if somebody gets this right and does it well, then I think that we're going to be in a really great place from many, many different perspectives. So high quality content showing up in the feed, brought to you by a sponsor, giving unique audience insights, unique data back to you so you can target and retarget. The value of the time spent with that content is really interesting. Both the FT and The Economist have started actually trying to sell advertising, not attention stream specifically, but just advertising in general based on time spent, which I think is an amazing idea. I'm not sure how it will do or how the market will receive it, but I love the idea because it sort of rewards. Isn't that really the point? You want people to read the content or watch the content or consume the content, and the more time they spend with it, especially with an advertisement present in that process, then the more value presumably there is. So attention stream is all about sponsoring your very best content directly in the social feed. You've seen some examples of it. And we have a growing number of proof points. Again, you heard some of them about the amazing click-through rates, amazing social engagement, amazing time spent with the content, a real positive advertising experience, and a positive consumer experience. So again, your content matters and you're winning. So now we're in the home stretch here, part 4. This is the last of my 4-part story here, the road ahead. So I'm going to make some predictions, and it's always dangerous to get up here and make predictions because I can't necessarily predict the future any better than the next person. And like Kara said, she said, there's some things I don't know. I don't presume to know all of this, and I'm probably going to be wrong about some of these things, but with that disclaimer, let me go ahead and get going here. So these algorithmic feeds, Twitter announced just 2 weeks ago today that they were going to do an algorithmic feed, and at least in some quarters, you thought the world might have ended. The hashtag RIP Twitter. This was a Wired story. What you need to know about it, it's touting it as one of the most significant changes in Twitter's history. I'm going to go back to this graph, this extremely complicated, sophisticated graph I drew earlier here. I just happen to think that when the content in my feed continues to exceed the hours in my day, you almost end up with no other choice but then to have an algorithmic feed. And here's my prediction, is that purple line's going to go up some more. And then maybe it'll go up a lot, and maybe it'll go up a little. I don't know. It'll go up some amount because the amount of content being created, I assume it will taper off at some point, but it certainly doesn't seem to have tapered off yet. And of course, the number of hours in the day is not going to go up. Maybe if you're lucky, you can sort of get people to sleep less and consume more content, but good luck with that strategy, right? It's essentially a fixed thing. Brett Taylor was the former CTO at Facebook. I loved this tweet he made here. The algorithmic feed was always the thing people said they didn't want, but demonstrated they did by every conceivable metric. It's just better. And I think that nails it. I mean, it's, if you ask people, and maybe if I ask you, do you want an algorithmic feed? Maybe you don't. There's all kinds of concerns. Is it an echo chamber, or are robot overlords going to take over the world? I mean, there's lots of interesting and legitimate debates there. I'm just saying, when companies put the algorithmic feed out there, it works better. And that's one of the things that I really think helped propel Facebook's growth. And people say Twitter's growth, sort of tapered off because the product was confusing. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. My own personal opinion is that their product and their growth tapered off, not because it was a confusing experience, but because it was, it's a sort of a flea market of information. It's very disorganized. What was Kara's analogy? It's like you take all the library books and dump them on the floor. It's just, you're never quite sure what you're going to get. And that's wonderful in some cases, especially around live events. But in general, for most users, it makes it a lot more difficult to consume content on Twitter. So we'll see with their new algorithmic feed what happens. And so Instagram, it's funny, when you go search algorithmic feed Instagram, and you try to sort of get a take on their position, not surprisingly, people don't like to talk about this because they get criticized a lot. So it's really hard to sort of get a real solid take on where Instagram stands, where Pinterest stands, where Snapchat stands. And I'm sure even if they're thinking about the algorithmic feeds, and even if they're building algorithmic feeds, they're probably not going to talk about it just because the backlash gets to be so significant. But here's my prediction, the first prediction, that you will see a lot more algorithmic feeds, especially as social networks get popular and the quantity of information continues to outpace our ability to consume it. I mean, it's sort of a logical conclusion, and I think we've seen plenty of proof points that prove that when you do it, you're going to perform better than when you don't, at least if you do it well. Number 2, instant articles. So the problem that Facebook's trying to solve is a real one, and I think you don't need me to tell you that. You know that the page load time on Facebook is a real significant issue. So I think Facebook does deserve credit for very much trying to solve a real problem. And it is absolutely uncomfortable for media companies, right? For you all. I'm taking a dependency on Facebook and I'm ceding even more control to Facebook. That doesn't feel like a very comfortable thing to do. And certainly Facebook is continuing to work on it. I know they work with many of you to make it more palatable, to sort out the monetization, the workflow, those types of issues. And what's not in doubt, though, is that it delivers a better user experience to the consumer. It's a much, much better user experience. For me, the analogy that comes to mind is it's like dial-up internet service versus broadband. And sort of what side of history do you want to be on? Do you want to continue to try to propagate a dial-up type experience on a mobile device, or do you want to do a broadband experience? And I think that analogy is apt given the amount of time it takes for some of those pages to load. And of course, Recode and Kara, we're talking about Twitter and Google teaming up for AMP, Accelerated Mobile Pages. They may want some marketing help with that name. It's a little bit of a mouthful to say, but the idea is a great one, improve the mobile experience. We'll see how that goes, and I think it's great news for media companies and for consumers. So that leads us to prediction number 2, which is instant articles and similar solutions will be wildly popular, basically because they deliver a much better user experience. Number 3, on native advertising, I told you I'd make a prediction about that. So as the native business grows, and I think it will continue to grow, the scale problems will become more obvious, right? Okay, I want to double my revenue from native now. Oh, I've got to hire that many more people. What are all these people? I mean, it starts to become a real challenge, and it becomes a more acute problem, I think. And labor-intensive businesses actually have negative economies of scale. Some of you may know that. I worked in a consulting business for about 10 years, and as you grow a labor-intensive business, or those of you from agencies probably understand this too, you have to have layers of management, quality control, systematic processes, and things like that. It's a lot harder to manage a group of 200 people than it is 100 people, or of 50 people, or of 25. So as you grow that, I think it becomes a much more acute issue. And then you add to that FTC thing we were talking about, which I don't think is likely to let up. And I'm going to lead to prediction number 3, which is the combination of the economics and regulation is going to significantly alter the world of native advertising. And we're going to see what happens here over the next 1 to 2 years. I think you'll see a lot of shifts and changes. And then last, this actually should be number 4, I think, video and virtual reality here. So Facebook hits 8 billion daily video views. This was back from November of last year, doubling from 4 billion in April. And again, you all are producing video. You understand that what Facebook is doing most directly and other platforms are doing around video. The damn Daniel viral Twitter video from earlier this week, the latest obsession. We've got Periscope and Meerkat and all these kinds of things going on. Very different production values than what we've traditionally been used to with video. The TV studio with the multi-cameras and all the exotic lighting, yields to people with an iPhone on the beach, in some kind of audio mic trying to capture things. So again, video is a very interesting and innovative world. And then go one step further on this VR. Zuck just this past weekend touts VR as the future of social media. And I, like many people, when you see this picture, you're like, oh my God, that is just, that's horrible, right? I mean, I can't imagine a world where everybody's like sort of, I don't know if you can even walk around that way, but it's just hideous. And you just look at that and you say, oh my God, there's no way, it's too awkward. And I didn't see Kara's presentation before, and I'm not going to use her colorful analogy, but if supermodels can't make Google Glass look good, how in the world is that sort of hideous-looking Oculus thing going to be widely adopted? And I guess what I would say is not so fast is, imagine the world of phones, right? Back when we all had flip phones that looked something like this or worse, it was awfully hard to imagine watching an episode of House of Cards programmed by Netflix, which, by the way, destroyed Blockbuster, on your phone. And by the way, Netflix takes like 30% or 40% of the internet's, streaming capacity, bandwidth capacity streaming its video. I mean, if I had told you that back when you had one of those things in your pocket and used it, you'd thought I was nuts. I mean, it's just crazy. There's no way. And even when they got into that kind of smartphone, okay, well, it's nice, it's got some buttons on it, but it's got an LCD screen, it's horrible in comparison to this, right? I mean, it's just hard to imagine what things might happen. So there's something about that VR space that, in my mind, don't think about the really hideous Oculus glasses. Think about the possibilities. And I think in the coming years, we're going to see some interesting things that are probably going to blow our minds every bit as much as what we've seen with the iPhone, iPad, and everything that's done to content. And so that's my prediction number 4. You'll see a lot more video-centric experiences and eventually a lot more virtual reality experiences. Again, not a huge leap to make that prediction given what Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook have been saying. So those are my predictions, and we're getting towards the end here of my time up on stage. I may be wrong. I fully stipulate that. And even if I'm right, my timing may be off. Ralph Rivera this morning, for those of you who heard his talk, said, hey, it's easy to predict, and it was easy to predict that the internet's going to win. Just knowing who exactly is going to win and when is the hard part. So I recognize that that's a challenge. But I will make one final prediction here before I wrap up, and that's that your content will continue to matter. and you're going to continue to win. And at Social Flow, we're really honored to be along for the ride. And thank you very much.